Harari, the generation that remembers what life was really like is ending. Have you ever sat with an elderly person, someone in their 80s or 90s, someone who was born into a world so different from the one you inhabit that the distance between their childhood and your present feels less like decades and more like the distance between geological epochs, and felt, beneath the ordinary surface of the conversation, something that you could not quite name but that pressed against your awareness with a quiet and growing urgency? Not nostalgia exactly, because the feeling was not primarily about the past. Not grief exactly, because nothing had yet been lost that you could point to. Something more precise than either of those things. The specific sensation of being in the presence of a kind of knowledge that is not written down anywhere, that cannot be transmitted through any digital medium, that exists only in the living memory of people who actually inhabited a world that is otherwise available to you only as history, as data, as the second-hand reconstruction of something that can be described but never quite recovered, and the awareness, growing quietly beneath everything else, that this knowledge, this specific form of living human witness, is running out. This feeling, which many people have had in some form without fully articulating what it is pointing toward, is not sentiment. It is not the generic sadness of watching older generations pass, which is simply the universal human experience of time moving in one direction. It is something more specific and more consequential than that. It is the perception of a particular threshold in human history, a threshold that is approaching faster than most people have allowed themselves to consciously register, at which the last living human beings who formed their fundamental assumptions about what life is, what community means, what work feels like from the inside, what privacy is, what love between people who have no algorithm mediating their relationship resembles, what reality is before it has been filtered through the specific distortions of the digital age, at which the last of these human beings will be gone. And with them will go not merely a generation, not merely a cohort of individuals who happen to have been born in a particular historical period, but something more irreplaceable than any individual life. The living, embodied, experiential memory of what human existence was like before the transformation that is currently reshaping every dimension of it was underway. I want to be precise about what I am claiming because the claim can easily be misread as a form of nostalgia, as a romantic attachment to the past, as the kind of conservative lament for a vanishing world that every generation has produced about the generation before it, and that has historically been as wrong about the value of what was being preserved as it has been right about the fact of what was being lost. I am not claiming that the world those older generations inhabited was better than the world we currently inhabit in any simple or unqualified sense. The world of 60 or 70 years ago was, by many important measures, a world with far more suffering than the current one. More physical pain, more infant mortality, more poverty, more racial and gender-based oppression, more exposure to the kind of arbitrary violence and arbitrary deprivation that modern institutional life has done much to constrain. None of these things are worth romanticizing, and any serious engagement with the past requires holding their reality in full view rather than filtering them out in favor of the elements that are easier to miss. What I am claiming is something more specific and more important than a simple preference for the past over the present. I am claiming that the specific generation that is now ending, the generation that formed its deepest assumptions about human life before the digital revolution, before the algorithmic mediation of social relationships, before the colonization of attention by systems specifically designed to exploit it, before the systematic dismantling of the forms of community and work and relationship with mortality that had structured human experience for millennia, this generation possesses a form of experiential knowledge about what human life is like when those structures are intact that cannot be recovered once the people who embody it are gone. And that this loss, which is happening right now quietly and irreversibly, at the pace at which the oldest living generation always passes, is one of the most significant and most under-examined losses that the current moment in human history is producing. To understand why this matters, you need to understand something about the nature of experiential knowledge that the dominant information culture of the current era systematically undervalues. We live in a culture that is extraordinarily good at producing, storing, transmitting, and retrieving explicit knowledge. The kind of knowledge that can be articulated in propositions, encoded in text or data or image or video, and transmitted across any distance and any time to any recipient with the appropriate access. This kind of knowledge is genuinely valuable, and the technologies that have expanded its availability have produced real and important benefits for human life. The ability to access the accumulated explicit knowledge of human civilization through a device that fits in your pocket is not a trivial achievement, and any honest engagement with the current moment has to acknowledge it as such. But there is another kind of knowledge, a kind that the same culture that is so extraordinarily good at producing and transmitting explicit knowledge is extraordinarily bad at recognizing and preserving, and that is experiential knowledge. The knowledge that resides not in propositions that can be articulated and transmitted, but in the specific texture of lived experience, in the felt sense of what it is like to inhabit a particular form of life from the inside, in the embodied understanding of what human relationships feel like when they are not mediated by algorithms, what community means when it is constituted by genuine mutual obligation rather than curated self-presentation, what privacy feels like when it is a structural feature of daily life rather than a temporary achievement requiring constant vigilance. What it is like to be bored in a world that has not yet invented the specific remedy for boredom that is also the specific destroyer of the capacity for reflection and depth. This experiential knowledge cannot be archived. It cannot be digitized. It cannot be transmitted through any medium except the specific medium of living human witness, the direct encounter between a person who has inhabited a particular form of life and a person who is trying to understand what that form of life was like from the inside. And when the people who have inhabited that form of life are gone, the experiential knowledge they carry goes with them, permanently and irrecoverably, regardless of how comprehensive the explicit documentation of that era might be. The generation that is ending now, the generation born roughly between the 1920s and the 1940s, is the last generation that formed its fundamental understanding of human life in a world without the specific distortions that the digital revolution has introduced into virtually every dimension of human experience. They grew up in a world where attention was not a commodity systematically extracted by commercial systems designed to exploit cognitive vulnerabilities, where relationships between people were conducted face-to-face at human speed, with all the friction and the difficulty and the genuine negotiation that face-to-face relationships at human speed require, where the information available about the world arrived through channels that were, however imperfect and however subject to their own distortions, not algorithmically optimized to produce the specific emotional states that maximize engagement at the expense of accurate understanding, where work for most people in most communities had a visible connection to the genuine needs of specific other human beings rather than the attenuated and abstract relationship to human flourishing that most modern economic activity produces, where death was present in daily life in ways that made the avoidance of mortality that characterizes modern culture not merely impossible but literally unimaginable. They know from the inside, from the specific texture of their own formative experience, what it feels like to live in a world structured by these conditions. Not as a historical fact, not as a sociological description, not as a comparison between then and now, but as the lived reality of their own most fundamental experience of being alive. And this felt knowledge, this experiential understanding of a form of human life that is increasingly available only as description and decreasingly available as living witness, is something that the current moment is allowing to pass from the world without anything approaching the seriousness of attention that its passing deserves. Think about what this means in concrete terms. Think about what an elderly person who grew up in a small community in the middle of the 20th century actually knows from the inside that you cannot access from from any source other than their direct witness. They know what it felt like to inhabit a social world in which every person you encountered in daily life was known to you, in which the web of relationships that constituted your social existence was built over years of actual shared experience rather than assembled from the managed presentations of curated online identities. They know what it felt like to be genuinely bored, to sit in a quiet room with nothing to do and nowhere to go and no device to provide stimulation, and to discover in that boredom the specific quality of inner life that emerges when the mind is left genuinely alone with itself. They know what it felt like to receive a physical letter written by a specific human hand, and to understand in the receiving of it that the words on the page represented a specific person's genuine effort to communicate something that mattered to them across a distance that made that communication genuinely effortful. They know what it felt like to learn a skill from another person, slowly through direct transmission of embodied knowledge in a shared physical space, and to understand in the learning that they were receiving something that had been developed over generations and that they were now responsible for carrying forward. They know what it felt like to be part of a community in which your presence or absence at a particular occasion mattered in a way that was immediate and concrete and felt by specific people who actually knew you rather than registered as a metric in an algorithm that has no experience of your presence or your absence. They know what it felt like to engage with political life as a citizen of a specific place, embedded in specific relationships of mutual obligation with specific other citizens of that place, rather than as a consumer of political content optimized to produce emotional engagement without the civic relationships that give political engagement its genuine meaning. These are not descriptions of a better world in any simple sense. The world they describe also contained genuine suffering, genuine injustice, genuine limitations on human possibility that it would be wrong to romanticize or minimize. But they are descriptions of a form of human experience that contains specific elements, specific qualities of attention and relationship and community and work and engagement with time and mortality that the world that has replaced it has not found adequate substitutes for, and that are becoming inaccessible as living experience rather than historical description at exactly the moment when understanding what has been lost and why it matters, and what it would take to recover anything genuinely comparable to it in conditions that are fundamentally different from the conditions in which it originally existed, is most urgently needed. Because here is the specific danger of losing the last generation that remembers what life was really like. It is not the generic danger of losing the past, which every generation faces and which every generation has managed imperfectly to survive. It is the specific danger of losing the living reference point, the embodied experiential standard, against which the specific distortions of the current moment can be measured and recognized as distortions rather than simply as the way things are. The people who grew up without the internet, without social media, without the algorithmic mediation of their attention and their relationships and their information environment know from direct experience that certain things about the current world are different from what they were, and specifically different in ways that feel like losses rather than simply like changes. They do not know this as a theoretical proposition or a sociological comparison. They know it as the specific felt experience of encountering the current world from the inside of a self that was formed in different conditions, of noticing the gap between what something feels like now and what it felt like before the transformation, of being able to say, from direct personal experience, that something specific has changed, and that the change has a specific quality that the change itself does not make available to the people who have never known the alternative. This is the specific epistemic resource that is disappearing as the last generation of living witnesses to the pre-digital world passes, and its disappearance matters not primarily as a cultural or sentimental loss, though it is genuinely those things as well, but as a practical loss of the most concrete and consequential kind, because one of the most significant obstacles to responding adequately to the specific pathologies of the current information environment, the attention economy, the algorithmic distortion of social reality, the epidemic of loneliness and meaninglessness that accompanies unprecedented digital connectivity, is the difficulty of recognizing these things as pathologies rather than simply as the normal conditions of human life. For the generation that grew up entirely within the digital information environment, the specific distortions of that environment are not distortions at all. They are simply the texture of reality, the way things are, the background conditions of existence that do not require explanation or justification because they have never been experienced as anything other than simply what life is like. The fragmentation of attention is not experienced as fragmentation by people who have never experienced sustained, uninterrupted attention as a normal feature of daily life. The management of relationships through carefully curated digital presentation is not experienced as management by people who have never known a social world in which the specific friction and the specific richness of unmediated face-to-face encounter was the primary medium through which relationships were built and sustained. The colonization of inner life by the constant availability of external stimulation is not experienced as colonization by people who have never experienced the specific quality of inner life that emerges in genuine, sustained, unchosen quietness. The living memory of the generation that is ending is, for all its limitations and all its blind spots and all the genuine injustices it witnessed, without adequately challenging the most direct available testimony to the reality that the current conditions of human life are not simply the way things have to be or the way things have always been, but are specific historical arrangements that have specific costs that are not always visible from inside the arrangements themselves. When that testimony is gone, when the last person who can say from direct personal experience that attention once felt different and relationships once felt different and community once felt different and reality once felt different is no longer alive to say it, something specific and irreplaceable will have been lost. Not everything, not the most important things, but something whose specific value, the value of living witness rather than historical documentation, of experiential knowledge rather than explicit description, will only become fully apparent after it is too late to recover it. There is a further dimension of what is ending with this generation that goes beyond the specific experiential knowledge of the pre-digital world, and that touches something even more fundamental about the human condition. The generation that is ending is, in most cases, the last generation for whom the question of meaning, of what makes a human life genuinely worth living, was answered in practice rather than in theory by the specific conditions of the world they inhabited, not because they had worked through the philosophical dimensions of the question with special care or special wisdom, though many of them had, but because the world they grew up in provided as a structural feature of daily life rather than as an achievement requiring deliberate cultivation, many of the specific experiential conditions that generate the felt sense of a meaningful life. The genuine community that embedded individual lives in webs of mutual knowledge and mutual obligation. The work that, for many, though certainly not all of them, had a visible connection to the needs of specific other people in specific places. The relationship with mortality that was imposed by the presence of death in daily life, rather than managed into invisibility by the combined efforts of medical technology and cultural avoidance. The simple physical reality of a world experienced primarily through unmediated sensory engagement, rather than through the specific abstractions of digital representation. These things were not, for the generation experiencing them, understood as answers to the question of what makes life meaningful. They were simply the conditions of life, the water in which existence swam. The question of meaning was answered implicitly, practically, by the texture of daily experience rather than explicitly philosophically, by deliberate reflection on what that texture was providing. And the loss of these conditions, which the generations that followed have experienced as a series of specific technological and social changes, rather than as the comprehensive dismantling of the structural foundations of meaningful existence, is visible from the outside. From the perspective of the generation that experienced those conditions as the default rather than the deliberate achievement, in a way that it is genuinely difficult to make visible from inside the conditions that have replaced them. This is one of the most important things that the passing of this generation means to lose. Not simply the historical testimony of people who lived through specific events in specific decades, however valuable that testimony is and however irreplaceable its loss. but the specific perspective of people who inhabited the full conditions of human meaning as a structural feature of daily life, and who can therefore recognize from direct experience rather than from theoretical analysis the specific ways in which the current conditions of life differ from those conditions and the specific costs of those differences that are not always visible from inside them. The conversation that needs to happen between this generation and the generations that have followed it, the specific and urgent conversation about what has been lost and what has been gained, and what of the lost things can be recovered in some genuine form adapted to conditions that are genuinely different from the conditions in which they originally existed, is a conversation that has not happened with anything approaching the seriousness and the urgency that it deserves. It has been displaced in the cultural attention of the current moment by conversations about technology and productivity and innovation and disruption that are framed in ways that systematically exclude the specific contribution that the generation with the longest and deepest experience of the pre-disruption world is uniquely positioned to make. And the window for that conversation is closing, not slowly, not at the comfortable pace of historical change that allows multiple generations to work through the implications of a transition before the transition is complete. Rapidly, at the pace at which the oldest living generation always passes, which is to say at a pace that will, within 1 or 2 decades, have reduced the population of living witnesses to the pre-digital, pre-algorithmic, pre-mass consumption form of human life from tens of millions to effectively zero. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you had this conversation? Not the generic conversation about the past that happens at family gatherings, the stories about how things used to be that are received with polite interest and filed as historical anecdote, but the specific, serious, philosophically engaged conversation about what it felt like from the inside to inhabit the world before the transformation. What specifically was different about the quality of attention and relationship and community and engagement with mortality? What was genuinely better and what was genuinely worse? And what, if anything, of what was genuinely better could be recovered or reconstructed in forms adequate to the genuinely different conditions of the present? I suspect that for most people reading or listening to this, the answer is no, not in any serious or sustained way. And I want to suggest that this absence, this failure to have the conversation that the specific historical moment of living through the passing of the last generation of living witnesses most urgently requires, is one of the most significant missed opportunities of the current era. Not because the conversation would necessarily produce clear or simple answers to the questions it raises, not because the generation being consulted has all the wisdom that the situation requires, or that their perspective on what has been lost is free of the distortions that all perspectives are subject to, but because the specific experiential knowledge that this generation possesses, the felt understanding of what human life is like when certain structural conditions are intact, is the most direct and most irreplaceable resource available for understanding what those conditions actually provide and why their absence is producing the specific forms of individual and civilizational suffering that are the defining features of the current moment. The fields of psychology and sociology and philosophy have produced in recent decades an extensive and increasingly sophisticated body of research and analysis on the specific ways in which the conditions of modern life are failing to provide the experiential foundations of human well-being and human meaning. The research on loneliness and its health consequences. The research on the relationship between social media use and depression and anxiety. The research on the decline of civic participation and community belonging. The research on what researchers call deaths of despair and their correlation with the dissolution of the specific social and economic conditions that previously provided the sense of belonging and purpose that those deaths reflect the absence of. This research is valuable, and the people producing it are doing important work. But it has a specific limitation that the living testimony of the generation that is ending does not share. It describes the problem from the outside in the specific language of scientific measurement and statistical correlation, in a way that is methodologically rigorous but experientially thin. It tells you that people who have high levels of genuine social connection have better outcomes by various measures than people who do not. It does not tell you, cannot tell you in its own language what genuine social connection feels like from the inside. What the specific quality of daily life is like when you inhabit a world in which genuine social connection is a structural feature rather than a deliberate achievement. Why the specific forms of simulated social connection that digital technology provides are so persistently inadequate as substitutes for the real thing in ways that persist even when people consciously understand the inadequacy and genuinely prefer the real thing. The generation that is ending can tell you this from direct experience in ways that the research cannot. And the window for asking them is closing in real time, at a pace that does not pause for the cultural conversation to catch up with the urgency of the loss. Now I want to address what might seem like the obvious objection to everything I have been saying, which is that every generation laments the passing of the one before it, that every era has believed itself to be living through a uniquely consequential transition whose costs are being inadequately recognized, and that the specific losses I have been describing, however real they may be, are simply the latest version of the universal human experience of change producing both gains and losses, with each generation focusing more on the losses because they are more immediately felt and less on the gains because the gains are harder to see from inside the transition. This objection is not entirely without merit. The tendency to romanticize the past and catastrophize the present is genuine and has produced genuine errors of judgment throughout human history. The people who mourned the passing of handwritten correspondence when the telephone arrived were right that something specific was lost and wrong to conclude that the loss outweighed the gains. The people who mourned the passing of oral storytelling traditions when literacy became widespread were right that something specific was lost and wrong to conclude that the loss was simply catastrophic. Genuine gains and genuine losses coexist in every transition, and the generation experiencing the transition is not always the most reliable judge of the balance between them. But there is something specific about the current transition that makes the standard version of this objection less applicable than it might otherwise be. The transitions that produced the objection's most compelling historical examples, the transition from oral to literate culture, from handwritten to printed communication, from horse-drawn to mechanized transportation, from local to national and then global economic organization, were transitions that changed the specific mechanisms through which human beings communicated and worked and traveled and organized their economic lives while leaving largely intact the underlying structure of human experience, the basic social world of face-to-face relationship and shared physical community, the relationship with time and with mortality that gave daily life its weight, the fundamental experience of attention as something you directed toward the world rather than something the world extracted from you. The current transition is different in a way that is not a difference of degree but a difference of kind. It is not changing the specific mechanisms through which human beings pursue the fundamental experiences that constitute a meaningful life. It is changing the fundamental experiences themselves. It is not providing new and more efficient ways to be genuinely socially connected. It is replacing genuine social connection with a simulation that activates the same psychological systems while failing to deliver the same experiential substance. It is not providing new and more efficient ways to engage with the world in a manner that produces the felt sense of genuine contribution and genuine purpose. It is replacing the specific forms of work and craft and community service that previously produced that felt sense with economic activities whose connection to genuine human flourishing is so attenuated as to be invisible from inside the experience of performing them. This is the specific quality of the current transition that makes the generation experiencing the pre-transition world from the inside and therefore able to make the comparison not as a historical or sociological observation but as a direct felt experience, uniquely and irreplaceably valuable as a witness to what is actually at stake in ways that the standard objection does not adequately address. So what does this analysis require of us? What are the specific responses that the impending loss of this generation's living witness most urgently demands? The first is the most obvious, but also the most consistently underperformed. It is to have the conversation deliberately, seriously, and with genuine philosophical engagement rather than polite social interest, with the specific people in your life who possess the experiential knowledge that is at stake. Not the conversation about historical events, though that conversation has its own value, but the conversation about experience, about what daily life felt like from the inside in conditions that no longer exist and cannot be recreated, what it felt like to be genuinely bored and to discover in the boredom something that the elimination of boredom has eliminated along with the discomfort, what it felt like to maintain a relationship with someone you loved across a distance without any of the technologies that make distance nearly irrelevant today, and to understand in the maintaining of it what distance actually means for the quality of human connection. What it felt like to be part of a community that knew you, genuinely knew you, in ways that the curated presentation of self that digital social life enables makes much more difficult to achieve. What it felt like to face the reality of mortality without the sophisticated cultural mechanisms for its management and avoidance that the current world has developed, and to discover in that unmediated encounter with finitude the specific quality of urgency and preciousness that the encounter produced. These conversations are not easy to initiate because the cultural conventions that govern intergenerational interaction in most contemporary societies are not designed to facilitate the specific kind of philosophical and experiential exchange that the situation requires. They are designed for politeness, for the comfortable exchange of information about family and health and general life circumstances, for the kind of interaction that maintains the social relationship without making demands that feel presumptuous or invasive. Having the deeper conversation requires a willingness to break with those conventions in ways that may feel awkward and that require the kind of genuine curiosity and genuine engagement with another person's experience that has become, like so many other forms of depth, somewhat countercultural in the current moment. The second response is to document this experiential knowledge with the seriousness and the intentionality that the urgency of its impending loss deserves. Not simply as oral history, though oral history has great value, but as a specific attempt to capture the experiential dimensions of a form of life that cannot be fully captured in any medium, but that can be approached more closely through certain kinds of interview and certain kinds of narrative than through others. The question is not what happened, but what it felt like from the inside to live in a world structured by conditions that no longer exist. And the answers to that question, however partial and however shaped by the specific limitations of each individual perspective, constitute a form of collective experiential testimony whose value is not reducible to its historical informational content. The third response is to take seriously, in the design of the social and institutional frameworks through which the next several decades of human civilization will be navigated, the specific lessons that the generation with direct experiential knowledge of the pre-digital world is in the best position to offer about what conditions of human life produce what kinds of experiential outcomes. Not as a nostalgic argument for returning to conditions that cannot be returned to and that were not entirely worth returning to even if they could be, but as a practical resource, the most direct available evidence about what structural conditions of human social life produce the specific experiential qualities of genuine belonging and genuine meaning and genuine engagement with the full dimensions of human existence that the current civilizational challenge most urgently requires. The fourth response is the one that is perhaps most difficult to articulate but most important to understand. It is to recognize that the passing of this generation is not simply a demographic event, not simply the latest turn of the generational wheel that every society experiences, but a specific and irreversible threshold in human history at which something specific passes from the category of living experience to the category of historical record. And to hold that recognition with the specific seriousness that genuine irreversibility deserves. Not the sentimental seriousness of mourning what cannot be preserved, but the practical seriousness of understanding that the window for engaging with what is about to become inaccessible is genuinely and urgently closing, and that the choice is made in the next decade about whether to engage seriously with the knowledge that this generation possesses or to allow it to pass unmourned and unexamined into the archive of things we knew we were losing but lacked the will and the urgency to attend to, will have consequences for the quality of human civilization that will persist long after the specific choices and the specific moment of their making have themselves passed into history. There is something profound and something deeply human about the specific grief of knowing that the last people who remember what something was really like are leaving the world. Every culture has had some version of this grief, has recognized in some form the specific and irreplaceable loss that the passing of living witness represents. The elegy, the memorial, the tradition of honoring the dead, not merely as individuals, but as carriers of a form of knowledge and a form of experience that their death removes from the accessible world. These are not peripheral features of human culture. They are central ones, expressions of the deep human understanding that what people carry in their lived experience is not reducible to what can be written down or otherwise recorded, and that its loss is therefore genuinely and specifically irreversible in a way that the loss of documented information is not. What is different about the current moment is the scale and the specificity of what is being lost, not simply the individual carriers of individual experiential knowledge, which is the normal and universal form of the loss that every generation of the dead takes with them, but the last carriers of a specific and comprehensive form of experiential knowledge about the conditions of human life before a transformation so thorough and so fundamental that the world after it and the world before it are, in the most important experiential dimensions, genuinely different worlds inhabited by genuinely different forms of human existence. The generation that is ending lived in one of those worlds. The generations that follow will live in the other. And the specific knowledge of what the first world was like from the inside, the specific experiential understanding of what human life is like when certain structural conditions of meaning and community and genuine relationship and unmediated engagement with reality and mortality are intact, will not survive the passing of the people who carry it, regardless of how comprehensive the documentation of that era might be, because documentation captures the explicit surface of experience without capturing the experiential substance that constitutes its actual reality. I want to end with something that is not a call to action in the conventional sense, not a list of things to do or a set of practices to adopt or a framework to apply. I want to end with something that is simply a question, but a question whose weight I want you to feel rather than simply register before moving on to the next thing. Think of the specific people in your life who belong to the generation that is ending: the grandparent, the elderly neighbor, the older colleague, the person who remembers the world before the television and before the internet and before the specific transformation of daily life that those technologies and everything that has followed them have produced. Think of the specific experiential knowledge they carry, the felt understanding of what human life is like in conditions that no longer exist and that no documentation can fully recover. Think of the specific conversations you have not had with them, the specific questions you have not asked, the specific form of attention that you have not paid to what they know from the inside, that you can only approach from the outside. And ask yourself, with the full seriousness that the question deserves, whether you are going to wait until the window has closed before you understand what was in it. Because the generation that remembers what life was really like is ending. Not as a metaphor, not as a philosophical claim about change and loss in the abstract, but as a literal, demographic, irreversible fact about the specific moment in human history that we are living in right now. And the knowledge they carry is going with them. The only question is how much of it you are going to receive before it is gone.